Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Aquascape Odyssey channel. Today, I'm going to be talking specifically about keeping Caridina shrimp and my experience going through and keeping them, as well as the research that I've done. The reason why I want to bring this to you today is if you are all interested in keeping Caridina shrimp, how can you go through and learn from my experience, the research that I've done, in maintaining them? I have successfully and unsuccessfully kept Caridina shrimp. I've kept Siloesi shrimp successfully. I've kept Caridina shrimp successfully. Unsuccessfully, when I first started out carrying or keeping Caridina shrimp, I didn't have success. I had bolt shrimp, blue bolt shrimps, in a 1.5 gallon, and we'll get into the list of items. It just wasn't successful. But now I'm at the point where I'm extremely successful in maintaining a Caridina shrimp tank, and I wanted to give all of you 5 quick tips on what I think are some of the best ways or best setups, eco-friendly, low maintenance. Low maintenance is the key thing for me. Aquariums, specifically for the Caridina genius of shrimp. So we're going to go through and talk to you about the best 5 tips on what I think you should know in terms of getting into the Caridina shrimp keeping hobby. All right, so let's bring up my list here. Okay, so tip number 1, I truly believe tank size is of essence here. Again, when I was talking a little bit earlier, so tip number 1, tank size and what is in the tank is what our tip will be. So aquarium setup, I guess, would be this one. So your aquarium setup is super important. I kept them in, and maybe other people have kept them in a smaller tank, but just from my experience, it's a lot harder since Caridina shrimp require a specific water quality. When you have smaller tanks, you have a lot of evaporation. I kept some in a 1.5 gallon tank, unsuccessful with that, and then I bumped them up to a 3-gallon tank. I have a small office here, so I had to have a smaller tank sizes in here, and I bumped them up to a 3-gallon tank. A little bit more successful, but I started seeing a decline in the water quality, and it just required more maintenance. I don't like maintenance in terms of upkeep with shrimp tanks, and I know you're probably saying, well, Caridina shrimps have high maintenance. I found out they don't, depending on the type of tank setup you've had. So then I moved them from the 3-gallon, because it was requiring more maintenance, more check-ins, more water changes, to a 5-gallon tank. And this is where the most success I've had. They are breeding active in this tank, and I actually keep them with fish as well. I keep them with chili rasboras. I have about 7 chili rasboras in a 5-gallon tank with with Caridina, not Neo. Come on, Michael. With Caridina shrimp in them. And you'll see videos as we go through talking about how I keep them and what it kind of looks like as we're going through this video. I'll tie some of the recordings that I have of the tank setup currently for the Caridina shrimp. So tank size, plants, if you want low maintenance, you definitely want to have plants and something just to look at, right? So I have this in my office. I love gorgeous aquascaping setups. So plants is a huge item as well, and that just helps the water quality, right? Breaking down, since I have fish in there, right? Breaking down the ammonia and then returning to that cycle of the tank. So plants are a huge one. And if you're gonna have plants, you have to have the right substrate. So that comes into that active substrate you typically want for your pH level. So if you're new into the Caridina hobby, in terms of the water quality, we'll talk about next, but a buffer substrate, so just buffer substrate when you're Googling, you want to decline or reduce the pH to a more acidic level. So we're talking in the area of around 6.0 to 6.5. I know in the all the websites you'll see sometimes lower than 6, but I currently have mine at around a pH of, I think it's like 7 to 6.9, 6.9 to 7.0, and they're excelling. They're breeding. The scape is just low maintenance. I love the setup as well. So that's hyper important. The substrate, active buffering. And if you're gonna have plants, I did this tank that you're watching. It has a nutrient-rich soil below. You can see the build video as well. The link will be in the YouTube channel description, and you can see how I built this specific tank. So I had an active nutrient-rich soil, capped it with sand, and then in the back, I actually added that active buffering soil. And the one I used was from ADA. You can go on Amazon if you're here in the States, and I believe outside the United States as well, looking for that active substrate. I'll put some links below as well, where you can get some active substrate. And which one I used, I've used a couple of different ones for plenty of my tanks. I've used the Fluval one, I've used the ADA one, and I believe I got one time just in a pinch when I went to the pet store versus the aquarium stores that we have here out in Arizona. So again, so we're talking tip number one, tank setup. So you have to have, in my opinion, larger than a 3-gallon tank. So I have a 5-gallon tank and they're doing amazing. Talked about those reasons. And then we talked about substrate port, that buffering substrate. And then I would also add some wood. So when wood starts to break down, or some type of scaping that has wood in it, it starts to break down, reduces that pH, releasing tannins into the water column. Water column. And then also builds up with a lot of biofilm, right? So you're having a lot of area for the shrimp to graze upon and keep them healthy. It's, in my opinion, majority of the times, I'm not really feeding that tank compared to my Caridina shrimp. It's a lot less maintenance-driven tank, which I prefer. So number one, tank setup. Now, number two. So as we go into number two, this is the water quality. So you were setting up your tank. We just talked about that tank setup. What should be in there? You have plants, you have the size. Filtration, I guess I should have added for number one. So back to number one. Filtration, you can get away with a aeration with a filter, sponge filter on that. I just am noise sensitive. So I looked up I didn't look up. I trialed and errored a bunch of hang-on back filters because I just don't like bubblers in my tank when you hear that oscillating pump going. I prefer hang-on back filters, and I tried at least 20 of them. You'll see a link in the description below to the one that I picked out for this tank, and for all of my tanks for that fact. There's different sizes that you can order that are extremely quiet. That's what I prefer. On my larger tank behind me, I have, on my 20-gallon, I have a Fluval 207 and then a 107 on my 10-gallon tank. And then the rest are all nano tanks. I do have a 3-gallon Caridina tank. And then I have that 5-gallon that you're seeing in these clips of my Caridina shrimp. So back to water quality. Number two, water quality is huge. That's something I learned. You can't use tap water, and maybe you can depending on your area. I would definitely check the TDS and the parameters, and we'll talk about the water parameters here in a second. But check that. I would highly recommend, if you have the resource in the area, to do RODI and remineralizer for them. I use 1 second here. All right, I'm back. So I use the bee shrimp from, what was this place? It's called like shrimp something. Salty shrimp. The bee shrimp remineralizer is what I use, and always had success with it with this tank in terms of RODI water. On the back has instructions on how to remineralize the water. I think this has made it steady throughout the transition of being in that tank. I don't have to worry about retesting and continuous testing that tank, and I haven't. I initially tested the tank just from an ammonia level. That's it. Ammonia nitrates and nitrates. I always get them mixed up on how they are said. So I'm sorry. I'm still learning in terms of the proper enunciation of them. I'm not really good at enunciating, so as you can tell. But yeah, being aware that that's what I tested. I didn't really test the GH or the KH. I did test the pH to make sure that was in line. I guess I'll take that back. I did test the GH and the KH initially before I put them in, but I haven't since. So after I've had it maintaining, everything's been hands off, which I prefer. And I already have shrimplets from the Caridina shrimp as well. And I have Galaxy Pearl. Sorry, I'm thinking of my Danios. I have Galaxy Pintos and I have red and black in one tank. So that being said, water quality, remineralizing with RODI water. What your targets are is in the area of 6 to 7.5 in that area of your pH. And then your TDS is going to be around 100 to 200 ppm. So you can actually get a test meter. That's what I did off Amazon. I only tested it for the first month to 2 months of cycling it and going through and doing that. And mine is right around 180 from the salty shrimp, B shrimp remineralizer. Hasn't fluctuated at all. I top off with RODI water whenever, and I haven't done any water changes. So, well, I did when I was cycling the tank. So before the shrimp got in, cycling the tank, that's a big deal as well, which we're going to talk about next. And then the GH target is going to be 4 to 6 DGH. And then your KH is going to be 0 to 2. I have mine at 0 when I was testing it. I haven't tested it since. And it's been running for about 4 months, I want to say, because 2 months. And then I added the shrimp. Then I already have shrimplets a month and a couple weeks later. So again, water quality, huge line item, I would say, when you're getting into Caridina shrimps on what those are. So salty shrimp, that's what I use, the B shrimp marine mineralizer with RGI for tip number 2, water quality. Number 3 is cycling the tank. So Caridina shrimp, I've found, feed more on biofilm and breaking down matter than anything else. Yes, you can feed them supplements or subsequently or whatever the term is in terms of feeding them. I personally do not feed them. And I don't want to say that because I have fed them. I typically feed them every 2 weeks, if that. It's a low maintenance tank. I don't do much to it aside from topping off, and that's it. And that can also probably be from the fish food that they probably have in supplements. But even when I'm feeding them, it's not an active food fight like I get from my Neo Caridina shrimp. They are actively feeding on the biofilm, excelling from that and the algae that's been building up with that as well. So being aware of the cycling of the tank is hyper important. I cycled my tank for 2 months. And another reason I'll add for cycling tank is when you're setting up your tank initially, it's going to go through those setup phases where you're going to get this one leached tannins for about a month. There's a ton of dermatitis building up from the spider wood that I had. It wasn't pre-soaked. So there was a lot of cycling that had happened. I almost personally just said, I'm going to restart this tank. And you can see the tank build video as well, again, back in the description of this channel. So cycling of the tank, hyper important. Again, reason being that if you're going through the cycle of it, well, you already want to have biofilm, a lot of that build up for feeding the shrimp when you add them, but also the cycling process of probably wanting to vacuum, right? If a bunch of algae builds up in an area or you're brushing off a lot of the wood, you don't want to have these fluctuating water parameters. Going back to water quality, number 2, you don't want to have these fluctuating water parameters that are causing stress on your shrimp, which I found less stress on them, meaning better for me because it's less maintenance of the tank as well. So it's kind of 2 and 2. Being aware that less stress on them means they're going to flourish. So that being said, going back to cycling, you're going to have that month to 2 month period of that cycling of the tank before it starts to get in that eco-friendly part and building up of the beneficial bacteria. And you don't want shrimp in there when you're doing that. So highly recommend cycling your tank to the point of where it's maintenance free. Mine took about 2 months. Yeah, 2 months for the cycling. And that was due to the wood, primarily the spider wood, not pre-soaked. And it could have been sooner, but that. And I will also add one more thing to help efficiently cycle your tank, especially when you're adding shrimp into it. I would add Bacter E that helps build up that biofilm areas. I definitely added that around the month marker just to help build up that biofilm. I thought I was going to be ready to add the shrimp in a couple of weeks, but more leaching happened from the tannins and I just like a clearer tank. Okay, so that was cycling your tank, number 3. Number 4, we're going to talk about little tank involvement. So this is a 2-factor for me just because I prefer low maintenance tanks. And that comes with back to the tank setup. Number 1, having that tank set up with the proper amount of plants and just overall nutrients for those to feed off of. And then also wood, right? Reducing that pH as it releases its tannins into the water column, keeping it at that steady with the buffering system that you have for the substrate. So little tank involvement, the less stress you're putting on the shrimp, the more they're going to excel. So this one, I've been more hands-off than I've ever been before in a tank. I'm not going through and readjusting things. I would also add in some moss. So I have Christmas moss in there. And just more surface area for biofilm build up, the better. So again, little involvement, less stress on the shrimp, less water parameters changing as well, increasing more stress on those shrimp, the more they're going to excel. Now, number 5, where you get your shrimp from. I saw this in another video when I was learning about Caridina shrimp. I think this is hyper important as well. I personally haven't gotten shrimp shipped to me. I am fortunate enough to have some great aquarium stores here in Phoenix, Arizona. But I think the caveat would be that if you're not in a location and shipment, that is definitely key. Now, that being said, from the reviews that I've seen and because I've thought about ordering shrimp, it's just you want to make sure whoever you're ordering shrimp from, talk to them before you order them. You want to check on that return policy or ask something outlandish in terms of, maybe not outlandish, but a question to see if they're responsive, right? Because if you order the shrimp, they're dead on arrival, that's a huge cost. Caridina shrimp are not cheap in the hobby in comparison to the Neo Caridina shrimp. And they're a lot more maintenance setup and learning process unless you're using some of the tips that I've talked to you about. And that's a lot of money that you're wasting. And of course, the shrimp, right? So being hyper aware of where you're getting them from. Local is always better because they're in the area. They're less stress on the shrimp because you got to think about it. If the shrimp place you're ordering them from is not locally breeding them, they have the stress of them being shipped there. Then they have the stress of them being shipped to you. And then again, having new water, different water parameters, I would say, because you're not going to get them spot on. It's not a laboratory from where you're ordering them from. So be hyper aware. If you can, I would highly suggest a local fish shop to get your shrimp from versus ordering them online. And then if you don't have that ability, ordering them online, but from a highly reviewed and responsive place. Aquatic Arts, I haven't ordered, well, I take that back. I have ordered stuff from them, and that was my vampire crabs. But being aware that the reviews, the process, talking with them prior to getting things shipped, just asking a simple question to help you gain that trust of them and that they actually know what they're doing. But Aquatic Arts actually does have, and that's here in the States, bred by. So that would be something to look at as well, because if they're breeding them there, you're not worried about that shipping time in terms of where they've been. And also, if they're getting them from somewhere outside of the States, you run the chance of them being more laboratory driven. And sometimes in majority of those are in a state of not high fluctuation because they're more controllable environments than what we're going to be able to provide for them. And maybe we can, some of you probably will, in terms of water quality, right? So being aware of that and that stress. So those are my 5 tips today. If you enjoyed this and you're new to Caridina shrimp keeping, feel free to comment, ask me questions, and kind of learn about my journey. And as you've been seeing my success through these clips that have been entered into here as well, please let me know if you have any questions. As well, this is a shrimp keeping, aquascaping community. We should all be helping each other to help push this community forward. So with that, please like and subscribe. Again, comment if you have any questions. But those are my 5 tips. We'll talk about them again. Tank setup. We talked about water quality. We talked about cycling the tank. We talked about that little involvement. And then we also talked about where you get your shrimp from. So that is my shrimp talk about keeping Caridina shrimp and my advice from keeping them and successfully breeding them now in the aquascaping hobby. Again, if you want to see the tank build, look at my YouTube videos. It is the Caridina step-by-step guide. Thank you all for tuning in today. I appreciate you watching this video.